Moving on, and let me mention, sorry, one other thing about thirds. Seconds, obviously, you can just see. The notes are right next to each other. Anytime you're looking at a third, you're looking at either adjacent lines or adjacent spaces. So as you learn to see these things right away and recognize them without counting, a helpful way is just adjacent lines, adjacent thirds. Those are always some kind of a third. Now, if we've got a fourth, we're always going line to space or space to line. And that's true of any even-numbered interval. So for example, say we start here. This number, 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth, what kind of a fourth is that? Like most of the fourths, it's a fourth that contains one half step. Because if you've got 3 steps in a row, chances are, in a major scale, one of those steps is going to be a half step. And so long as one of them is a half step, we're talking about a perfect fourth. So if our major thirds sounds like this, 2 major seconds added together to make a major third, just a half step bigger, there's that ring, there's the perfect fourth. It contains 5 semitones. Any fourth, and the great majority have 1 half step. Now, of course, there is one place within the major scale where you have a run of 3 wholes. One and only such place, one such place, right there. So when you take that perfect fourth, what would have been a perfect fourth with 1 half step, now there are no half steps. So it's as if you took that half step and you stretched it bigger by 1. So instead of 5 half steps, there are 6 half steps total. It's still a fourth because you count 1, 2, 3, 4. Anytime you take a perfect interval and make it larger, you talk about an augmented interval. I'll use a capital A. That is an augmented fourth. It contains 6 half steps. Moving on now to the fifths. Most fifths, again, almost all of them, within a major scale, are again going to contain 1 half step. So if I just take this bracket, make it a little bit bigger, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 1 half step in there. So all I've done is I've taken my perfect fourth with 1 half step in there somewhere, doesn't matter where, and I've added another whole step. So if the perfect fourth had 5 semitones, the perfect fifth has 7. So there's my perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and there's the ring. That's why we call it perfect. Now, notice what notes did I use to get my augmented fourth? I used the notes that are involved in those 2 half steps. And the ones that are the unstable ones, right? The mediant, important scale degree, well, the tonic, the most important ones. The other ones involved in those half steps, the less stable, less important notes involved in half steps, the B and the F, scale degree 4 and scale degree 7, that's where I had that span of 3 whole steps in a row. Now, not coincidentally, if I simply do that same span, and instead of from F up to B, from B up to F, 1, 2, 3, 4, so, sorry, counting 4 steps, but counting notes for the interval, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So now this is some kind of a fifth, but this is a funny fifth. This is the only fifth that contains both of the 2 half steps in the major scale. Because it contains both of them, it's going to be a half step smaller than a perfect fifth. Anytime you get a perfect interval and you make it smaller, we call that diminished. We use a lowercase d. This is a diminished fifth. So here was my augmented fourth. There's my diminished fifth. Those are enharmonically equivalent intervals. The frequency ratio here to here and the frequency ratio here to here are the same. Remember the lesson on key signatures and this 6 half steps around the scale. Well, the augmented fourth and the diminished fifth both contain 6 half steps. They're halfway around that distance, they're halfway through that distance of the octave. If we think of an octave from F to F, that's going to contain 12 half steps total. If we go through 6 of them, we get either an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth. They sound the same, but they're named differently. Now, that sound is sometimes given the informal name of tritone. Tritone simply for three tones, the three whole steps in there. But even though that's rather specific, tritone names either one of these. Be very careful, even though as musicians we'll talk about tritones all the time, but be careful in your theory homework. You want to distinguish, if you're being asked to name an interval, tritone is not an acceptable answer because it's too vague, because people use it for both of these things. Make sure that you talk either about an augmented fourth or a diminished fifth, treating those as different things because they're spelled differently, they're notated differently. Okay, moving on. So we've had our fifths. A lot of the time, if you, well, let's see, let's pick a different one. If I take the fifth from here to here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a perfect fifth. Now, if I expand it upward by 1, and there's a half step there, that's going to be a sixth, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's some kind of a sixth. But it's the small one. It's a one that's just a half step bigger than a perfect fifth. That's a minor sixth, and it contains 8 semitones. So there was my perfect fifth from 3 up to 7. This is an imperfect consonance. The minor sixth. If, on the other hand, I expand my perfect fifth by adding a whole step, as here between D and E, now I've got a major sixth with 9 semitones. So add a whole step onto a perfect fifth, and again, it has that pleasant but less stable, less ringing sound. If I again take my, well, let's keep this right there. There's my major sixth. If I make it bigger by 1, up here, again where one of the half steps is, so that was a major sixth, and now it's bigger by 1. It's a seventh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's a seventh, but it's 1 larger than the major seventh. Because it's not perfect, it's going to come in major or minor, and because I just added a half step, this is going to be the small one, minor seventh. It has 10 semitones. So this was my major sixth, and there's my minor seventh. And you can hear the dissonance. It's considered a dissonance. Okay? And of course, if I go back to my same major sixth and simply expand it by adding a whole step, now I've got 11 semitones. There's my major sixth. Add a whole step. Now I've got a major seventh. It's got 11 semitones. And of course, where is there to go from there but the octave? And of course, octaves are perfect. So there you go. Those are all of the intervals found in the major scale. All of the possible intervals you can make. And you might want to play around with that. I mean, we didn't look at every single interval. See if you can't find some others. You won't be able to. That's all of them. All of the intervals found in the major scale are right there with their qualities, basic sizes, abbreviations, and number of semitones.